In this chapter, we're going to start with working on the eyes of the character. For this, we really need to start with some modeling procedures and get the eyes modeled so that we can actually rig them properly and get all the kind of expression out of them that we're looking for. Eyes can be very expressive and can help tell a lot about a person. The common saying is, eyes are the windows to the soul. That isn't just the shape around the eye, but actually the eye itself. In this case, we have an eyeball that I've modeled up, and I'm about to remodel this for you just to show you how I went about doing this. One of the things that really helps tell a character's disposition or what they're thinking can be the pupil. Quite often, actually, that's something that's watched to tell if somebody is telling the truth or not, is whether or not their pupil dilates. It also helps sell something like surprise. The pupil will dilate to try and let in more light. If the character's angry, it might be a smaller pupil. So what we need to be able to do is actually be able to animate the pupil growing and shrinking in size to be able to get more of a defined feeling about the character. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to hide everything off, and I'm going to quickly model an eyeball for us. This isn't going to be sort of the best eyeball could be modeled. It is basically an idea of the direction you can go, since this is not a modeling DVD. I'm going to start with your basic sphere. You could do it with a lathe. You could do it in several different fashions, really, to build an eyeball, but for all intents and purposes, the concept will be just the same. I'm going to start off with some more segments in it to make sure that it's good and smooth, and we've got a nice round eyeball to work with. This is going to be the actual underlying part of it, and what you do is you build your eyeballs in two pieces. First off, we're going to need the eyeball that houses the cornea and the pupil. And so I'm going to place an edit poly modifier on top of the stack. I'm going to go into subobject vertex and select the area that's going to be our cornea, and I'm going to flatten this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it flat and then move it back in. Now, we don't need all of these rings around. What we're looking for is actually one ring inside here is going to be the pupil. The next ring out going out to the edge of the eye here will be the cornea. So what we can do is we can use the edge ring, or sorry, loop method, and then in Max 7, because what we're in here, I have to go through a two-step process to be able to remove this cleanly. So convert to vertex, and then step back to the edge mode, remove, back to the vertex mode, and remove. Now, Max 8, there's a one-step process there. It's called remove clean, and I believe it's control, click on the remove button, and it'll remove the vertices as well as the edges. So now what we have is an area here that we can actually go and define as a cornea and a pupil. What we're going to do actually for the animation is simply use a method of scaling this up and down to be able to dilate the eye. Next, we're going to set up some material IDs so that we can ID it properly. Spheres already come up as ID 2, so that's going to be the cornea. The pupil is going to be ID 3. So I'm just going to pop over into side here and actually ignore back facing off and select all of that and make that ID 1. And what I can now do is just make up a quick material. I'm just going to start with a new one here. We just need a multi-sub material. We need 3. 1 is going to be the white of the eye. 2 is going to be the color of the eye, so let's say maybe a brown eye of some kind. And of course black. Now, another way to do actually the pupil is to actually delete the center portion so that it sees right through to the eye and actually has no surface to it at all. That's really how the eye is built. There's a hole through the middle of the eye that where the light goes through, bounces off the back of the retina. But in this case, we're just going to go with this system. So there's essentially our eye set up. Now you can see that we've got this rounded edge because automatically the sphere is trying to smooth itself. So on top of the stack here, I'm just going to add a smooth modifier. There it is. And set it to auto and find the level at which it smooths it out. Everything but this corner here. So now we actually have an edge over the eye. So now we've got is the ability to be able to scale up and down that pupil in the animation. What you might want to do as well is you might want to set it in or shape it. So this is a real simple version of this. You know, the cornea obviously has more shape to it and whatnot. You can get away with most characters with this, depending on how close you're going to get to the eyes. The next thing we need to do is we need to actually just I'm going to make a quick copy of this, clone it. This is going to be the outer portion of the eye, the lens portion, and I'm just going to remove those two modifiers off there. I'm going to bump the radius up a little bit so it's a little bit bigger than the other one. The same thing back in the material editor. I'm just going to make a material for this, and this would be your basic glass shader or the likes, and so you can set up a glass shader for this. But essentially what you'll have now is you'll have a transparent lens over top of the eye. Now of course the lens of an eye isn't completely round. It's not completely curved on the surface, and you don't want that either. You want a bit of a bump on there. That bump actually changes as the eye tries to focus. However, in this case we're not going to worry about the focusing part of it, but we don't want a perfectly round surface or else our highlights don't look completely real. We want a little bit of a bump. Easiest way to get that in this case is, again, edit poly modifier. I'm just going to select the end, turn on soft selection, turn down the amount a fair bit here, and what we want to do is we just want to be able to bump out the end of the lens to give ourselves the shape to the end of the lens so it's not a round surface. Now if we render this, we'll be getting highlights on the lens portion. We'll be able to see through to the underlying portion of the eye. So we actually get a reasonably good looking eye. Now of course textures are needed, and again if you're going to get really close you need to model it more shape and whatnot. But what we have is a good mechanical system that we can connect up now to get the eye to work. In our current system, the way we're going to do this is that we are going to animate this row of vertices in the middle to get larger, smaller. To do that, we're going to simply work with an X-form modifier, but we're going to work with it on a selection of vertices. So what we can do at this point, since this is all modeled the way we want, if we want we could collapse it or we could build up the stack more. I prefer to collapse them when I really don't need to go any further. I also prefer to have models as a base model of a mesh, not a poly. They tend to just be faster in the viewport in general still. So again, with our center row of vertices that we'd left selected last time selected, we're going to pass that up to an X-form modifier. And now what we can do is we can scale use the scale of the X-form to actually drive the pupil up and down in the animation. What we're going to do is we're going to connect this up to a set of spinners and sliders in the next part of the tutorial, so that you can just have a spinner for each eye or a slider for each eye that allows you to be able to dilate the pupils at will, and even unevenly if you wanted, from side to side. Now we're going to apply what we've learned about the eye to the eye that I've built for the actual character here. I've left most of the stack intact. This is the outer part, and here's the inner part of the eye. I've actually hooked it up with an X-form, and you can see the gizmo on it here. And if I scale the gizmo, the pupil will actually dilate and contract. And I've left the stack intact. Now we really don't need this whole stack in here, so we could use a collapse 2 on the stack and get rid of that out of there, so that we'll just have the X-form. I've put a poly select on top of the stack just because it turns off any selections in any display of vertices that you'll get if you don't put it on. So I've just put it on there and just turned off the selection so that we don't end up seeing it. So now what we really need to do is, I'm just going to go do the same with the other eye as well. I copied over the eye from one side to the other. I didn't mirror them. It's not a good idea to mirror things. I just simply copied it over and made sure the position was on the positive value as opposed to the negative value as to where it currently sits in world space. And you can see that right now it's sitting in a positive 2.2, and this one will be sitting in a negative 2.2. And I'm going to do the same thing here as well. I'm going to go in and collapse 2, and again just check to make sure the X form is working the way I expect. And you can see that it actually dilates the pupil as well. What we need now is a control object for the eyes. This is going to serve two purposes. One, it's going to be for housing the controls for the dilation of the pupils, as well as it's also going to be the control for the target for the direction of the eyes once we set that up. Now what we can do is we can go in and just build one. Oops, we're not on a correct layer here. Let's go back down to make sure the rig layer is active. So we build new objects, they don't disappear on us. Now I can build this by hand as well. If you go onto my website, there's also control objects, there's spline objects, and it'll actually build it for you and add text to the center and everything as well. What we're just going to call this is Ogre Eyes, and we can scale up the text so it fits inside of it. Select our circle, convert to spline, and attach the Ogre Eyes text in there. I also centered it to on the center of world space, down the center, so I know that it's in the middle. And we're then going to move this out in front of the character's eyes, and this will be the position at which we'll target it. And you really want it to be as close as possible. Now it's not going to matter because the way we're going to rig up the eyes, the targeting for the eyes, they're not actually going to change from the way we've modeled them. You'll see what happens when we get to that. We want to color this maybe something a bit better, maybe dark blue. And now we need to put a custom attribute on here so that we actually have the ability to be able to store custom attributes on the control object and be able to adjust the eyes and any other parameters we want for the eyes at the time. Now what I'm going to do is I don't really think I need a pen attribute holder for this, so I'm just going to use the attribute holder modifier, which is just a blank modifier, and I'm going to custom script the attribute just so that I show it again. Def equals, so def is going to become our attribute. Attributes is the way you create a custom attribute. Ogre Eyes. Open close the brackets. We need a parameter block, and we're going to need a rollout. So let's just first build the parameter block. I'm going to call this eyes P for parameter block. We're going to tell it what rollout that this parameter block is going to be connected with, and that is going to be eyes R. Open and close brackets. The rollout, the same thing, so it's eyes R. And we can just name the user sees eyes. Open and close the brackets. And now we need a spinner. Now maybe we want to do a spinner slider type connection. That's possible as well. So let's just start with a spinner anyways. And oops, pupil and SP for spinner after it. I was going to do that. Pupil. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with building the parameter block. And the parameter block, first we need to give it a parameter that we'll see in track view. We'll call it pupil. And we have to tell it what type of value that the parameter block is going to hold. In this case, it's going to be a float value. And then we need to tell it what UI items it is actually connected with. And it is going to be the spinner. If we evaluate this, we should get no errors back to the listener, and it should give us back an attribute definition that's correct. So we know that this now works and it's all been coded correctly. We now need to add this attribute definition to the Ogre's eye control, and cust attributes.add is the command for that. Although MaxScript isn't case sensitive, I always capitalize and write my commands as though it is, just so that it all reads properly. We now need to list what object the parameter is going to go on, and in this case it's going to be the currently selected item, so $sign dot modifiers, and it's going to be the first modifier. Now we could also do this by name as well. We could actually list the name of the modifier. So we can also do it like this. Now the problem with doing it this way with the attribute holder is currently if I evaluate that, it'll throw an error, and it's because there's a space in the name. Spaces in names are a big no-no. There's two ways you can deal with spaces in names, and that is with single quotes around the name, and it'll read it. So there's another way you can do it. Now one of the problems with this method here is if I change the name of this attribute holder, this will have to change as well. But we can do it this way, and then we want to list the actual definition. In this case, def is returning our definition because we already evaluated that. So I should be able to evaluate this now, have it evaluate to true in the listener, and it'll apply the attribute to the actual control. Now we might want to be able to take it so that it's right now the eyes are in that sort of mid spot. We might be able to want to take it up and down from there. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go back and edit the custom attribute. So now let's actually go back and update our definitions so that we have the correct range to deal with that we're looking for. And also let's go and add the spinner, the slider, sorry, that's going to be connected to the same attribute so that it's being driven by both. And what we can do first off is let's actually set a range to this. So if we say range, and it's a 3-point value, which is the starting value, so we'll say -100 comma the highest, so that's the lowest value, highest value, comma the start value, and we'll call that 0. Now the scale currently setting is actually 1, but it'd be very odd for this pupil binner to start at some odd value. You kind of want to be able to reset it back to its sort of default position with a 0. So we're going to deal with the math later to take whatever our current value is of our XForm modifier, which will actually be a scale of 1, 1, 1 in X, Y, and Z, and we're going to tie that into a spinner that starts at a value of 0 and work it out from there. So what you need to be able to do to redefine this, as I've shown in previous ones, is first off you need to make sure you actually have the definition. Now in this case, because I haven't closed Max, def still returns that definition. If it didn't, what you can simply do is go def equals cust attributes dot get def, and then list the definition and where it is. So in this case it is sitting on the attribute holder on the currently selected object, and this is the definition that we want, so dot ogre eyes. And if I return that, now I've definitely made sure that the variable def holds that definition. To update it, I'm just going to remove the def equals here, and on the next line above the brackets, though, the next line right below attributes is redefine colon def. And now when I actually run this, and I don't want to run this line as well because I don't want to add the attribute again, I just want to simply run this chunk of code here. So I'll select it and go shift enter, and it will update the definition. So now it actually goes to -100 to 100. Let's add a slider. And I call those SL. And I'm not going to put any name in there because it's going to be the same as that one. And the range, the same thing. So I can either list it again or create a variable out of it. Now we need to tie it into the UI. What we do is we put brackets around and a comma to split them up. And if I tie those two together, I now actually have a spinner and a slider being connected together. So again, I'll just redefine this, and we've got a spinner and a slider. You can see they can actually control each other. It might be nice. That's kind of cool. You can also do other things with the sliders and spinners. If you take a look in the MaxScript reference under slider, you'll actually see you can do things like orient vertical after it. So we could actually change up the orientation of this. Orient vertical, and what we'll end up with is a vertical one. Now what we might want to do is put them side by side, and you can also arrange control objects like this, or items, UI items, into columns, so you can go across two. What it'll do is it'll split the rollout into two columns so that they can actually sit side by side. You can also now do offsets or absolute positions. I prefer using offsets. Let's offset the slider so it sits further over to one side, and let's offset the spinner so that it sits over to the left side, and push them up and down. Now you can either use an offset. Let's actually try this and go align. There's an align command and right, and this one we'll want to do an align left. And you can see that pushes them over. And of course you can also do things like field width and make your spinner wider. Again, we could also do an offset even on this. Even though we've pushed it to the right, we could say offset, and we want to push it down so it's more it's beside the slider. Let's say you could say first numbers across, so 0, comma, let's say 30 down, and we'll see what that does. We'll see how that ends up positioning our, and it's positioned it just about smack dab in the middle, so it was a good guess. So now I actually have ones that control each other sitting side by side. I could even make that field width wider. And you can see why I actually go about the trouble of scripting my own custom attributes, is I have way more control over building a UI that I like and that the animators are going to be happy with, that I'm going to be happy with if I'm animating the rig, as well as I can save this off and run it on the next character. I mean, I have tons of these attribute definitions floating around for all kinds of different control panels that I've scripted up, and I don't have to go back through the custom attribute tool to rewrite them every single time. They're there, they're just waiting. I just open them up, run the lines of code, and close them off again. So there's a nice little setup for the pupil then. Next step is to connect up the pupils, so the X-form that is controlling the size of the pupil, to the actual parameters that we've set up here. So I'm just going to minimize our script. We don't need it at the moment. Go ahead and grab our object, which is buried in there somewhere. There it is. And what we're going to do is we want to wire the gizmo scale to this. So I'm going to go down to wire and modified objects, X-form, gizmo scale. Now the gizmo scale, and I'm going to connect it up to the pupil attribute that I've added. The scale is an XYZ value, a 0.3 value, so all the values are contained in one. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a variable here so I can pump it into the two axes we need. We also need to know what axis we need to work on. Throw it on local, and you see it's Y and X is that we need to scale this on evenly. Essentially on Z we don't need to do anything at all. So let's make up a variable, pupil, and we want it to start at a value of 1. So what we're going to do is say pupil, because it's currently 0, plus 1. That means that it'll actually not change its current size the way it currently is. I'm going to go and create our 0.3 value out of this, so it'll be val, comma, 1. So on the x and the y, pump the val variable into it, and on the x, just leave it as a scale factor of 1, and connect in this direction, say connect. And when I adjust the size of this now, you'll see the pupil get larger and smaller, and it's just going to get absolutely huge, essentially. And you can even see it's getting so big, it's being multiplied so much that going into a negative value makes it look like it's getting big again. So we need to put a multiplier in there. So what we need to do is we need to put some brackets around pupil, and inside pupil we need to multiply it by something. I happen to know it's got to be pretty small, so I'm going to start with the 0.01 and say update, and now we've actually got a pretty reasonable amount of pupil dilation going on. You can see that the pupil is dilating. It can still actually, at 100, we're pretty much going right to the edges of it, and at negative 100, we're going too small. So what we can do now is we can go back and we can actually put limits, better limits on the actual attributes themselves. So let's go and open our script back up, and let's have a look at our definition. Let's make sure def still equates to the definition. It does. Ogre eyes. And or else we'd have to go and get it again. So now we can just go in here and say, okay, so the range is going to be something different than this, probably negative 80 to like positive, positive 80, let's say, to be able to do this. Now, instead of changing both of these, it's usually best to make some sort of local variable, and we'll call this local range equals and we'll call that negative 80 to 80, and then what we have to do in here is we just need to type in range. Now if we ever need to change it again, we only need to change one variable instead of a bunch of them. So now again, let's just redefine, and now our value only goes from 80 to 80, and there's our scaling happening. Now, one of the things that I've also done on this eye, let's see if we can see it, I actually dished the eye in a little bit, and see if I can pick it out there. You can see I've actually dished it in. Now this means that the center for the gizmo had to be placed in such a spot that I could scale it and it wouldn't end up being dipped in like this, because that's not looking very natural. So we actually do need to do a bit of scale on the z-axis. So let's actually go back to our setup for the wire parameter here, type in val and update it and see what happens, and actually you can see that it's pushing it right out a bit. So in the way that I've set it up, it actually had some dish to it, and I was actually expecting to scale it on all three values. So you can see that now it's actually dishing properly. So let's just go back to a control object, zoom back in here for you, and you can see that it's actually working quite nicely. And there's the thing being scaled up and down. So now that we've got one set up, I know I can just grab this entire bit of code out of that eye, go in and select the other eye, and exactly the same thing here. Let's go to wire parameters, modified xform gizmo scale, and let's go over and get the pupil, paste in our piece of code, and it should work on both now. But now what you might want to actually do is you might want to set it up so that we actually had a right-left setting. because sometimes you might want to actually scale them separately. What we need is a right-left spinner, and we could go and easily set that up, and we need to hook them up obviously to individual controls. So essentially the same thing, just doubled up, and you can set up right pupil, left pupil settings, and we could get a nice right-left setting going. For the most part though, that is the end of the pupil setup to have that all work. Now let's get on with targeting the eyes.